It's a subtle question, maybe even uncomfortable, but it's at the heart of what we're about to explore. Today's video dives deep into the timeless wisdom of Alan Watts, who once said, "You cannot know what is good for someone else if you do not know what is good for yourself." What does that mean for us in a world obsessed with fixing, saving, improving, and controlling? What does it mean for the well-meaning parent, the kind-hearted activist, the healer, the coach, the friend, the partner? If you've ever tried to help someone and it backfired, if you've ever found yourself drained from trying to do the right thing, if you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered why you care so much, please consider hitting that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so you never miss another exploration like this one. If you're already subscribed, thank you. You're part of a growing community of thinkers, feelers, and seekers. And if at any point this video resonates with you, I'd be deeply grateful if you hit the like button, leave a thoughtful comment, or share it with a friend who needs to hear this. Your support helps keep this channel alive, and for those of you who feel especially generous, what challenges us to stand still, to listen, to become present, to understand ourselves before rushing to change others. It's a radical idea, the desire to help others, noble, beautiful, well-intentioned, and the hidden ego that often rides beneath it. It shows up in our careers, our relationships, our politics, our spirituality. We want to uplift, empower, heal, but do we really know what people need? Or are we projecting our own fears, our own unmet needs onto the people we're trying to help? What urges us to pause that projection? He invites us to look inward, not in a narcissistic way, but in a radically honest way. Because if you don't know what peace feels like in your own body, you see, the deepest kind of helping isn't about doing it all. It's about being. It's not about rushing in with solutions, advice, strategies, or spiritual slogans. It's about being a witness to someone's journey without needing to hijack it. It's about being present enough with yourself that your presence becomes healing to others. That's a completely different paradigm of service, and it begins with self-understanding. But here's where things get even more subtle. Sometimes, we help not because they need us, but because we need to feel needed. We show up not because it's the right time for them, but because we feel anxious or uncomfortable doing nothing. We can't stand their pain, so we intervene. We can't stand the silence, so we speak. We can't handle powerlessness, so we try to control. What saw this tendency in all of us? He wasn't condemning it, he was exposing it with compassion. Because once you become aware of it, you have a choice. You can start shifting from compulsive fixing to conscious presence. You can shift from doing out of fear to being out of love. And that's what we're going to unpack in this video through stories, examples, and reflections that might just change the way you see service, empathy, and the entire idea of doing good. So grab a cup of tea, take a deep breath, and let's step into this exploration not to find quick answers, but to ask deeper questions. Not to become heroes, but to become whole. Once again, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you find value in this video. And if you feel called to support this work directly, the Super Thanks feature is right below. Let's begin. The old parable of the monkey saving a fish is one of those stories that feels almost humorous at first until you realize how disturbingly accurate it is when applied to real life. In the tale, a monkey sees a fish swimming in a river during a flood. Out of a sincere desire to help, the monkey pulls the fish from the water and gently places it high up in a tree to save it from drowning. The monkey smiles, satisfied with his kindness. The fish, of course, dies. This is the kind of misguided altruism Alan Watts speaks of when he says, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." It's a quote we've all heard before, often thrown around casually when someone's well-meaning plan backfires. But what goes deeper? He challenges not only the outcome of good intentions, but the very root of them, arguing that the desire to become better, to do good, is itself laced with ego, presumption, and contradiction. At its core, the problem isn't that people are trying to do good. The problem is that the very framework through which we define good is often self-serving and culturally biased. Think about the monkey again. He wasn't trying to hurt the fish. In fact, he may have risked his own safety to climb that tree during a storm. But he never stopped to ask whether the fish needed saving in the first place, or more importantly, whether his idea of saving made sense to anyone other than himself. This is not a trivial observation. The world is full of examples where well-meaning interventions, often born from cultural or moral superiority, create more harm than good. Consider the countless school campaigns across the United States centered around character education. These are programs designed to teach kids how to be good people, emphasizing kindness, respect, honesty, and responsibility. Sounds wonderful, right? Yet in practice, these programs often become mechanized, punitive, and hollow. Students are given point systems for good behavior, are encouraged to report on each other's moral failures, and are sometimes even publicly rewarded or shamed based on how well they conform to predefined ethical norms. Instead of fostering genuine empathy, they breed performance. Kids learn not how to be good, but how to look good. They internalize that morality is something measured, judged, and traded for approval, not something lived with awareness and integrity. What's more disturbing is that these children begin to conflate virtue with external validation. A child may hold the door open for a teacher not out of kindness, but because they want a gold star. Over time, this mindset spills into adulthood. We see it in social media, where people post photos of themselves doing charity work, volunteering, or helping someone in public, sometimes with hashtags like #blessed or #givingback. While some may argue it inspires others, it's also undeniable that this often becomes a form of moral exhibitionism. The act is no longer about the other person. It's about the self-image of the doer. This moral contradiction is what Alan Watts exposes with surgical precision. When we desire to be better, the very act of that desire acknowledges a lack, a deficiency. It's like trying to relax by force. The harder you try to relax, the more tense you become. The effort itself defeats the purpose. Similarly, try to be a good person through conscience. Everything that follows is compensatory, not authentic. Take, for example, the often discussed phenomenon of white saviorism, a term used to describe when people, often from Western, privileged backgrounds, go into impoverished or war-torn regions to help the locals. There are countless documentaries and TED Talks unpacking this behavior. The intentions may be good, but the mindset is fundamentally flawed. It assumes that the helpers know what's best, that they understand the culture, the needs, the context, and that their presence is inherently valuable. The result? Unsustainable solutions, offended communities, dependency, and sometimes more chaos than before. But perhaps the most insidious part is that the helper leaves feeling good about themselves, rewarded for their kindness, while the recipients are left to deal with the unintended consequences. It's not unlike the monkey, feeling proud of saving the fish, completely unaware that he has caused its death. There's a deeper psychological mechanism at play here, one rooted in the human need for identity and control. When people say, "I just want to do the right thing," what they often mean is, "I want to feel like I'm a good person." This is not malicious. It's a deeply human impulse, but it becomes dangerous when the feeling of being good overtakes the actual outcomes of one's actions. The irony is that truly good actions, acts of deep empathy, selfless care, and moral courage rarely feel glamorous. They often go unnoticed. A nurse working night shifts, changing adult diapers, and comforting dying patients is not usually celebrated on social media. A father working 2 jobs and giving up his own dreams so his children can go to college doesn't get hashtags. But these are the real acts of goodness, quiet, humble, unrecognized. Watts isn't arguing that we should stop doing good or trying to improve. What he's saying is that the motive behind our actions must be examined. Are we helping because someone truly needs help and we understand their situation? Or are we helping because we want to feel useful, superior, or morally righteous? This is where the contradiction becomes most clear. The person who wants to be virtuous is already trapped, because they're acting not out of virtue, but out of the image of virtue. True goodness, like true beauty, doesn't declare itself. It exists silently, naturally and without need for applause, who never complain despite hardships, or the old man who feeds stray dogs every morning. They're not trying to be good, they just are. They don't talk about virtue, they live it. This is what Confucius meant when he said, "The goody-goodies are the thieves of virtue." When people try too hard to appear righteous, they often end up hollowing out the very meaning of morality. In a society where image is everything, authenticity becomes rare. And what calls us back to this authenticity not as a moral position, but as a way of being. But his goodness is sometimes so excessive, so performative, that it borders on parody. He becomes, in a way, unbearable to those around him because his actions are coated in moral sugar but lack emotional depth. It's not that Ned is a bad person, but his kind of goodness feels disconnected from real complexity, from empathy that understands gray areas. In contrast, characters like Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird embody a more grounded kind of virtue. Atticus doesn't talk much about doing the right thing, he just does it, even when it's hard, even when no one is cheering him on. That's the kind of goodness Watts gestures toward. Not an identity, not a brand, but an inner alignment. The bottom line is this: good intentions are not enough. They can be dangerous when they come with blindness, ego, or the need for moral reward. Helping others requires more than wanting to help. It requires listening. It requires humility. It requires the courage to admit that you don't know what's best for someone else, and maybe not even for yourself. Alan Watts is not condemning kindness. He's challenging ego masquerading as kindness. He's asking us to think beyond the simplistic binaries of good and bad, to step into a more nuanced, conscious way of relating to the world. Because in the end, the monkey's mistake wasn't that he wanted to help. His mistake was assuming that he understood what help looked like. And unless we're willing to ask, to listen, and to reflect, we're just more monkeys dragging fish up trees feeling proud and doing harm. When Alan Watts criticizes the idea that we must bring civilization to them, he's not just making a political point, he's challenging the moral foundation of modern Western thought. Beneath what seems like generosity lies a deep and dangerous assumption, but necessary. It's a kind of moral arrogance that has shaped the past few centuries of history, often under the guise of nobility and progress. Consider the British Empire's expansion across India and Africa. British officials, intellectuals, and missionaries often claimed that they were civilizing the savages. In reality, what they did was dismantle local economies, destroy indigenous cultures, and exploit both land and labor. India, for instance, had a sophisticated system of education, trade, and agriculture long before the British arrived. Under colonial rule, many of these systems were hollowed out. British goods replaced local industries, and famine, once rare, became devastatingly frequent. Not because the British intended it, but because they reorganized Indian agriculture around export crops like cotton and opium. Even more disturbing is how colonial administrators often spoke of their mission in deeply moral terms. They weren't just conquering, they were helping. They framed the relationship not as domination, but as stewardship. This allowed them to carry out violence, censorship, and economic control with a clear conscience. They believed they were doing the right thing. And this is exactly the kind of dangerous self-righteousness that Alan Watts warns against. When you believe you're saving someone from themselves, you feel entitled to override their will, their culture, their choices. You don't see it as oppression, you see it as compassion. This moral illusion didn't end with colonialism. In fact, it has evolved into modern forms of geopolitical intervention. Take the United States' involvement in Vietnam and Iraq, two of the most controversial military campaigns of the last century. It was to remove a dictator and establish a free society. But the reality on the ground tells a more complex and often tragic story. In Vietnam, the phrase, "we had to destroy the village in order to save it," became an iconic expression of this paradox. Tens of thousands of civilians died. The political system that emerged after the war did not reflect Western ideals, but the scars left by the intervention lasted for generations. In Iraq, the initial invasion removed Saddam Hussein, but it also dismantled the country's infrastructure, security, and social fabric. The power vacuum led to civil war, the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, and a death toll that far exceeded what anyone had predicted. Again, many of the people involved in these decisions believed they were doing the right thing. They were motivated, at least in part, by the belief that democracy is always good, that people want it and need it, and that delivering it by force if necessary is a form of justice. This is precisely where good intentions become toxic. When you export your own political system, your own moral values, your own cultural framework, without first understanding the context you're stepping into, you're not liberating anyone. One of the most extreme examples of moral violence disguised as salvation is the Inquisition, particularly in Spain and Italy during the 15th and 16th centuries. The Catholic Church were exiled not because they had harmed others, but because they held the wrong beliefs. This was not framed as cruelty, it was framed as spiritual healing. The logic was terrifying. Better to suffer now and save your eternal soul than to live in sin. Again, the people running the Inquisition saw themselves not as villains, but as moral agents of divine justice. But if the villagers don't use the filters, perhaps because they don't trust the technology, or because they have their own traditional methods, the organization often blames the people rather than questioning its own approach. This is not just a theoretical problem. A real-world example involved a well-funded nonprofit that delivered dozens of high-end water purification systems to a rural village in Laos. The machines were sleek, efficient, and expensive, but it was integrated into daily life, something they shared communally, passed down through generations. The project failed, not because of bad intentions, but because the organization never asked what the people actually wanted or needed. They came in with answers to questions that no one asked. Alan Watts isn't the first to critique this mindset, but he brings a philosophical sharpness to it. He reminds us that every culture, every community, every person has their own rhythm. In religious missions that dismantle indigenous spirituality in favor of doctrine. Each time, the justification is the same: we're helping. But help without listening isn't help, it's conquest. Even in personal relationships, this dynamic plays out. Imagine a well-meaning parent who forces their child into a prestigious university or career path, believing it will bring success and happiness. The child may feel unseen, suffocated, or even traumatized. But the parent insists, "I just want what's best for you." That phrase, which sounds so loving, often masks a deeper truth. I want you to follow my idea of what's best, not yours. It's a microcosm of the same moral coercion that shapes global politics. What Alan Watts asks us to see is that goodness without humility is dangerous. That to help others, we must first unlearn the belief that we already know what's best for them. It's not enough to have resources, technology, or power. What's needed is respect. Respect for difference. Respect for mystery. Respect for the idea that other ways of life, no matter how unfamiliar or inefficient they may seem, are valid and meaningful. This doesn't mean we should abandon efforts to help, or that we should turn our backs on suffering. It means we should help differently, not from a pedestal, but from eye level, not with answers, but with questions, not to impose, but to accompany, to walk alongside people in their own journeys, not drag them onto ours. Ultimately, the legacy of colonialism, missionary work, and moral interventionism is not just about what was done, but how it was justified. And those justifications are still with us. They show up every time we act out of certainty instead of curiosity, every time we assume superiority instead of equality, every time we confuse force with care. What forces us to confront that the real danger isn't malice, it's moral confidence. The unshakable belief that we are right and that others must be corrected. The desire to improve humanity crossed an invisible line from aspiration into arrogance. When Alan Watts recounted the story of geneticists and scientists gathering philosophers and theologians into a room to ask them what kind of humans they should begin to engineer, he wasn't telling a science fiction tale. He was sounding an alarm. These scientists were on the verge of being able to manufacture traits: kindness, intelligence, courage, obedience, almost like selecting ingredients from a menu. Their question wasn't whether they should do it, but which traits to prioritize. That's a moment Watts found chilling, because buried inside that conversation was a silent assumption that we can and should design the ideal human being. But who gets to decide what ideal means? Who determines which characteristics are superior? And perhaps more crucially, how can anyone predict what will still be good in 10, 50, or 100 years? The very premise of perfecting humanity is filled with dangerous implications. History has already shown us the nightmare version of this dream. Hitler's vision of a genetically pure Aryan race is one of the most horrific examples. He didn't just believe that one group was superior, he set out to systematize and enforce that belief. The classification of humans based on perceived genetic worth, these were all rationalized by the goal of creating a better society. The Holocaust was its most catastrophic expression, justified in part by a perverse obsession with purification and genetic strength. The Nazis didn't see themselves as villains. They believed they were improving the world. That's where scientific hubris becomes especially dangerous, when it's wrapped in moral certainty. The desire to enhance life, to reduce suffering, to promote well-being, those are worthy goals. But the line between healing and controlling, between supporting and manipulating, can be razor thin. When we start deciding which traits are worth keeping and which ones aren't, we're no longer caretakers of life. We are authors, rewriting the book of nature with only a partial understanding of the plot. Consider modern genetic engineering tools like CRISPR. They allow scientists to make precise edits to DNA, potentially curing diseases like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, or even some cancers. That's an extraordinary breakthrough. But CRISPR doesn't come with ethical instructions. Once you can remove a harmful gene, what's to stop you from altering eye color, height, or IQ? What's to stop prospective parents from requesting designer children who are not just healthy, but brilliant, athletic, and beautiful? You don't have to be a philosopher to see the problem. If only wealthy families can afford these enhancements, inequality will become biologically reinforced. Natural diversity, the range of human strengths and limitations that has driven creativity and adaptability for millennia, could be eroded. Worse, there's no guarantee that the traits we deem valuable today will remain relevant tomorrow. A society optimized for intelligence might forget the need for compassion. Genetic changes aren't Lego bricks. They don't always function in isolation. You might eliminate a gene associated with disease. When we edit genes, we're not just changing one variable. We're intervening in a living system more complex than we fully understand. This pattern isn't new. We've seen it in agriculture with genetically modified organisms, GMOs. Crops like corn, soybeans, and rice have been engineered to resist pests, grow faster, or yield more. In the short term, that sounds like a win: more food, less waste. But over time, these modifications can lead to monocultures, where vast areas of farmland rely on a single genetic strain, locking farmers into contracts with agrochemical companies. What started as innovation quickly becomes control. Watts's deeper point is that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, we still don't know what the future holds. What we consider virtuous or valuable today might be obsolete or even harmful tomorrow. There was a time when being a good swordsman was a critical human skill. Now, it's largely ceremonial. There was a time when memorizing large volumes of information was a sign of brilliance. Now, we can Google anything in seconds. What kind of person will be most needed in 2050 or 2100? We simply don't know. This uncertainty isn't a flaw in our knowledge. It's a feature of life. Civilization has always evolved in response to surprises: climate shifts, pandemics, revolutions, technological disruptions. Our greatest strength as a species isn't uniformity, but adaptability. That adaptability comes from diversity, not just of skills and perspectives, but of personalities, temperaments, and ways of being. If we start engineering humanity toward a narrow ideal, we risk extinguishing the very variability that has allowed us to survive. And yet, the temptation to fix, to improve, to control is persistent. It shows up in smaller, everyday ways too. Productive, compliant, relentlessly positive. Social media algorithms promote specific types of bodies, voices, and lifestyles, subtly erasing the beauty of difference. The quest for the perfect human, whether through genes, behavior, or branding, is often driven by fear. Fear of disorder, fear of failure, fear of the unknown. We imagine that by creating better humans, we can create a better world. But what invites us to ask, better for whom? Under what conditions? For what future? A society full of highly intelligent, morally pure, obedient citizens might sound utopian at first glance. But in practice, it could be deeply dystopian. Without dissent, there's no progress. Without struggle, there's no resilience. Without the full spectrum of human emotion and experience, including flaws, there's no art, no poetry, no innovation. Even in science fiction, the most compelling stories often explore the tension between perfection and freedom. Think of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where humans are genetically engineered and socially conditioned to fit predetermined roles. There's no war, no hunger, no disease. But there's also no choice, no misteri, no authentic individuality. The cost of perfection is the loss of humanity itself. What wasn't just issuing a philosophical warning, he was pointing to a pattern we keep repeating. The desire to make the world better without first understanding it. To intervene before we observe. To edit before we comprehend. His message was less about stopping progress and more about slowing down long enough to ask deeper questions. What does it mean to be human? What is goodness? Who gets to define it? Perhaps the greatest danger of modern science is not that it's wrong, but that it's right in the wrong ways. That it solves problems we didn't fully understand, with solutions we can't fully control. That it gives us power without wisdom. What reminds us that knowledge is not the same as insight, and control is not the same as care. So what do we do with our growing capabilities? Do we reject them altogether? That would be reactionary and wasteful. The better path is humility, a willingness to say, we don't know everything. We may never know everything, and that's okay. Maybe the best version of humanity isn't the one we design, but the one we allow to unfold. Maybe it's not about creating better people, but creating better conditions for growth, for connection, for learning. Maybe the goal isn't to build saints and geniuses, but to nurture the full range of human experience, messy, flawed, and magnificent. Life isn't simple. People aren't problems to be solved. They're mysteries to be engaged. When scientists ask, what kind of humans should we create? They're asking the wrong question. The real question is, can we accept the humans we already are? Because only from that place of acceptance, of presence, can true transformation begin. Not imposed from the outside, but emerging from within. In the modern world, medicine is often seen as the most advanced, reliable, and necessary of all human endeavors. Few people would argue against its value. We've eradicated diseases, extended lifespans, and made childbirth significantly safer. But as Alan once provocatively pointed out, we've also inherited a dangerous tendency to see the human body not as a living, interdependent system, but as a machine with replaceable parts. This reductionist view, breaking things down into smaller and smaller pieces to be fixed independently, may be useful in engineering, but in biology and human experience, it frequently leads us astray, which are viral and unresponsive to antibiotics, with powerful medications simply to be safe. In livestock farming, antibiotics were used to accelerate animal growth, not to treat illness. What began as medical innovation spiraled into dependency. The consequence of this overuse has been profound. In our urgency to eradicate what we define as bad, we rarely consider what role that so-called bad thing might be playing in the larger ecosystem of the body. Nowhere is this more evident than in cancer treatment. Our methods, surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, are often violent. We poison the body in hopes of killing the invader before we kill the host. The man had suffered a major stroke. He was nonverbal, barely conscious, unable to recognize his loved ones. He flinched in pain during procedures but couldn't say why. Yet his wife insisted on not giving up. To her, love meant doing everything possible. At one point, she was quoted saying, "I don't care if he's not really here, I just can't let him go." She was praised by some for her devotion. Others, particularly those caring for him, saw only suffering without purpose. This is the emotional equivalent of antibiotic overuse. It's the application of effort without reflection, of action without wisdom. It's rooted in love, yes, but also in fear. Fear of death, of letting go, of failure. And fear is often what drives the medical system itself. A fear of lawsuits, of bad outcomes, of looking like we didn't try hard enough. So we keep treating, keep testing, keep pushing. There's a cultural expectation in many Western societies that doing something is always better than doing nothing. If a loved one is sick, we must act. If we hesitate, we are failing them. But sometimes doing nothing, sitting, holding, listening, accepting is the most courageous act of all. What's understood this deeply? He saw how our addiction to fixing blinds us to the wisdom of allowing. Not passive neglect, but active presence. There's a difference between surrender and abandonment. One comes from love, the other from avoidance. Think about the way hospitals are structured. Departments are organized around systems. Cardiology, neurology, oncology, pulmonology. Each has its specialists, its own language, its own protocols. If you have heart failure and kidney disease, you may see two different doctors who rarely speak to each other. If your depression is affecting your immune function, or your chronic pain is linked to past trauma, the system may not know how to integrate those pieces. It treats what it sees, not what it doesn't. This compartmentalized view of the body leads to a form of tunnel vision. A lung specialist may not consider how grief is impacting respiration. A dermatologist might prescribe a cream for eczema without asking about the patient's diet, stress levels, or living conditions. A psychiatrist might prescribe an antidepressant without exploring how loneliness or purpose might be more powerful medicines. This is not a criticism of doctors individually. Most are doing their best within a system that rewards speed, specialization, and procedural clarity over holistic understanding. Even medical education reinforces this bias. In many top schools, the body is taught like a machine: muscles, bones, nerves, organs. The soul, if mentioned at all, is left to religion or psychology. Emotional intelligence, empathy, and narrative competence, understanding a patient's story, are still seen as secondary to data. And so, this isn't just about human error. It's about a deeper worldview, the idea that health is the absence of disease, that life is a problem to be solved, that the body is a battleground. But what if health is not the absence of symptoms, but the presence of connection? Not just physical, but emotional, social, spiritual? What if healing sometimes looks like acceptance, like knowing when to stop? Consider the rise of palliative care and hospice medicine, which aim not to cure, but to comfort. These fields are still underfunded and underrespected, but they represent a shift towards sanity. They acknowledge that death is not the enemy, that suffering is not always something to be eliminated, but sometimes something to be honored, to be walked through with dignity. They bring the body back into relationship with the self, the family, the community. What's would argue that real healing involves integration, not dissection. That we're not parts, but patterns, not machines, but ecosystems. And that interfering with those ecosystems without humility often leads to consequences we can't foresee. We see this in environmental health as well. Spraying pesticides to eliminate one pest may cause another to flourish. Culling one species can destabilize an entire food chain. Replacing natural rhythms with artificial ones, daylight with screens, soil with concrete, forests with cities, has physiological consequences: disrupted sleep, increased anxiety, weaken immunity. The body, like the planet, remembers what we forget. It suffers when we treat complexity as inconvenience. So what's the alternative? It's not to abandon science or medicine. It's to marry them with wisdom, to expand our definitions of health and care, to ask better questions. Not just what can we do, but why are we doing it? Not just how do we kill the disease, but what is this disease asking us to see? And perhaps most importantly, to reclaim the art of presence, to sit with the dying without rushing, to listen to the anxious without correcting, to touch with gentleness, not just gloves, to see not just the chart but the person, not just the pathology but the story, because in the end, the body is not a machine, it's a mystery. And while mystery can be terrifying, it can also be beautiful. What reminds us that control is not the only form of care, that sometimes the deepest healing happens not through intervention, but through understanding, not through force, but through compassion, not through fixing, but through simply being there. Alan Watts often quoted ancient Chinese philosophers like Laozi and Confucius to reveal the contradictions embedded in modern moral thinking. And nowhere is that more apparent than in our obsession with appearing virtuous. Laozi's insight that the highest virtue does not know itself as virtue, and therefore it is virtue, paired with Confucius's observation that the goody-goodies are the thieves of virtue, exposes a deeply unsettling truth about our age, that the moment we become aware of our goodness, we're no longer truly good. Real virtue is unconscious. It acts without claiming credit. It doesn't perform, it doesn't signal, and it doesn't seek applause. It just is. This idea clashes violently with the contemporary culture of moral exhibitionism, especially in an era where digital platforms reward performative behavior. Today, the simple act of doing something kind rarely stands alone. It's often accompanied by a caption, a filter, and a well-crafted hashtag. Hashtag giving back, hashtag dogood feel good, hashtag blessed. Social media has made it incredibly easy to confuse being good with looking good. And in many cases, looking good has become the more desirable goal. Take, for example, the trend of influencers visiting impoverished communities, sometimes in developing countries, taking stage photos with barefoot children, then leaving with nothing changed except their own follower count. The justification is often that they're raising awareness. But awareness of what, exactly? Themselves? The situation? The systemic issues? And who benefits? The children who become background props in a carefully filtered shot? Or the influencer who now has a visual receipt for their goodness? This isn't to say that sharing good deeds is inherently wrong. Of course, people are inspired by stories of generosity and courage. But the problem arises when the sharing eclipses the act itself, when the story becomes more about the hero than the helped, when the moral high ground becomes a stage. Alan Watts would argue that this is exactly where morality becomes hollow, when it stops being a natural expression of compassion and becomes a strategy for status. These acts of goodness are less about correcting injustice and more about building reputational capital. CSR becomes a shield, a distraction, even a form of moral laundering where a company cleans its conscience with a few high-profile donations. You'll often see massive oil companies, for example, or fast fashion brands promoting body positivity campaigns while relying on sweatshop labor. The contradiction is obvious, yet because the messaging is so well packaged, many people accept the performance at face value. It's easier to believe in the narrative than to look behind the curtain. What Watts is pointing out alongside Laozi and Confucius is that the obsession with virtue as identity, as something to possess and display, distorts its essence. Virtue is meant to arise spontaneously, like breathing. It's not something you do to be seen. It's something you do because it's natural, because it's aligned with your being. When you breathe, the moment you try to turn breathing into an achievement, you're no longer breathing freely. You're performing. This moral ego is insidious. It hides beneath phrases like, I'm just trying to be a good person, or I want to make the world a better place. On the surface, these sound admirable, but too often, they mask a subtle sense of superiority, the desire to be seen as enlightened, compassionate, awakened. When someone is obsessed with being perceived as good, their actions become distorted. Kindness turns into a tool. Empathy becomes selective. Generosity comes with strings. You see it in politics too. Candidates often build entire campaigns around their moral credentials, how much they've served, sacrificed, donated. The message isn't just, I will lead, it's I'm a better person than my opponent. Debates become morality contests rather than policy discussions. Voters are asked not to choose based on ideas, but on character narratives that are often carefully manufactured. And because our culture rewards image over substance, whoever seems more virtuous wins, even if their actual record suggests otherwise. Religion isn't immune, either. In many faith communities, morality becomes performative. People go to church, pray publicly, and recite the right phrases not because they feel deeply connected to the sacred, but because they fear judgment or crave social approval. Faith becomes a costume. This is what Jesus himself criticized when he warned against praying on street corners to be seen by men. The message is ancient, but we still haven't learned it. Real virtue, what suggests, is quiet. It doesn't broadcast itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It might not even look like virtue to others. A person who quietly forgives a lifelong enemy, who walks away from conflict, who gives anonymously, who listens instead of lecturing, these are acts that don't trend on Twitter or public recognition. So we've built a society that often overlooks the genuinely good and celebrates the loudest performers. That doesn't just erode our understanding of virtue, it changes our behavior. People begin to ask, what's the point of doing good if no one sees it? And in that moment, virtue dies. Because it's no longer about others. It's about self. There's a subtle but important distinction between doing good and being good. The former can be calculated, strategic, even manipulative. The latter is a quality of presence, a way of moving through the world. You can do good for terrible reasons. You can volunteer for selfish reasons, donate for tax breaks, stand up for a cause to build your resume. But being good is about how you live when no one's watching, how you treat a stranger, how you respond to discomfort, how you listen when there's nothing to gain. Watts is inviting us to move away from this externalized model of morality, to stop chasing the image of virtue, and instead cultivate the conditions from which real virtue can arise. To injustice, to need without needing a reward. It's not easy. In a world that constantly asks, what have you done lately? It takes courage to act quietly. Is it because we truly feel connected to others, or because we want to feel like the kind of person who does? Modern culture, with its emphasis on achievement and recognition, doesn't encourage that kind of reflection, but it's necessary, because without it, we become trapped in a cycle of moral consumption, doing good not to serve others, but to consume the feeling of being good. And in that cycle, even our most noble acts become hollow. In the end, the truest acts of virtue may never be known. They won't be posted, praised, or promoted. They'll live quietly in the moments where we choose love over ego, presence over performance, humility over applause. That is the kind of goodness Watts admired. The kind that doesn't need to know it's good. The kind that simply breathes. Alan Watts once pointed out something that sounds deceptively simple. You can't truly know what's good for someone else if you don't even know what's good for yourself. This is not just a philosophical statement. It's a challenge to the entire way we think about helping others, about morality, and about change. So much of what we call help is really about us, our need to feel useful, to feel virtuous, to feel like we've made a difference. But what if the other person doesn't need the kind of help we're offering? What if our help is really an intrusion? The question Watts pushes us to ask is this: am I doing this because they truly need it, or because I need to see myself as the kind of person who helps? When you look closely, we want to fix it because we can't stand the feeling of helplessness. A classic example is when someone tries to console a grieving friend by offering advice or telling them to stay positive. The grieving person doesn't need advice, they need presence. They need someone to sit with them in their pain. But for the person trying to help, silence feels unbearable, so they talk. True humility isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's about recognizing that you don't have all the answers. It's about accepting that your perspective, no matter how well-meaning, is limited. When you start from humility, you approach others with curiosity instead of assumptions. You ask, "What do you need?" rather than saying, "Here's what you should do." And often, what people need most is not a solution, but understanding, not action, but attention. Presence is one of the most undervalued forms of help we can offer. Or being there isn't enough. But Watts reminds us that presence is the foundation of connection. Don't just do something. Stand there. Be fully present. That line flips the modern mantra on its head. We are so conditioned to believe that doing is always better than not doing. But sometimes, our doing is what creates more harm. Being present, on the other hand, allows life to unfold without forcing it, without imposing our will. This is where the Eastern philosophy of Wu Wei comes in. Wu Wei, often translated as non-doing or effortless action, doesn't mean doing nothing. It means not forcing. It's about aligning yourself with the natural flow of life rather than constantly trying to control it. Imagine a river. You can swim with the current, or you can exhaust yourself trying to swim upstream. Wu Wei is about noticing the current and moving with it. When it comes to helping others, this means listening deeply to where they are, what they want, and how they see the world, instead of dragging them into your vision of what you think they should be. Deep listening is an art that we've almost forgotten, most of the time, or shift the focus. But real listening means suspending judgment and just hearing the other person, hearing not just their words, but their emotions, their pauses, the things they don't say. It requires setting aside your own need to fix or prove something. It's incredibly simple, but it's also incredibly hard because it forces us to step out of our ego. Self-awareness plays a critical role in this process. If you don't understand your own motivations, you will constantly project them onto others. Maybe you volunteer at a shelter because you care about the homeless, but maybe part of you also does it because it makes you feel superior to those who don't volunteer. Maybe you donate money because you truly believe in the cause, but maybe part of you also wants the tax write-off or the social recognition. None of this makes the act wrong. But being unaware of your motivations can turn good deeds into subtle forms of ego inflation. Watts would argue that without self-awareness, our moral actions are half-blind. When you're not preoccupied with your own image or agenda, you can see others more clearly. You can meet them where they are instead of dragging them to where you think they should be. That's why Watts and many Eastern philosophers emphasize knowing yourself. If you don't know your own fears, your own biases, your own desires, you will unconsciously impose them on everyone else. Think of how often well-intentioned people create problems because they never stop to question their own motives. Parents often pressure their kids into pursuing careers they don't want: law, medicine, engineering, because they think it's best for them. But is it really for the child? Or is it because the parent wants to live through their child's success? Pushing solutions onto communities without ever asking what the people in those communities actually need. One of the clearest real-world examples of this is how some development programs fail in poor countries. A nonprofit might donate large amounts of clothing or food to a village, thinking they are helping. But if that village already has local tailors or farmers, those businesses collapse because they can't compete with free goods. The result is dependency and economic disruption. The nonprofit meant well, but they didn't listen. They didn't understand the local context. Their help was more about feeling like saviors than truly serving the people. Watts's philosophy invites us to approach life with ethical restraint. This doesn't mean inaction. It means acting with awareness and sensitivity, knowing when to step in and when to step back. It means resisting the urge to impose our solutions, even when we think we're right. It means realizing that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let others find their own way, even if they stumble, even if they fail. Self-awareness also helps us see when we're trying to fix others because we're avoiding our own discomfort. It's much easier to focus on someone else's problems than to face our own. We can spend years trying to save others as a way of distracting ourselves from our own healing. But true compassion doesn't come from a place of avoidance. It comes from a place of wholeness. When you've done the work of understanding yourself, your wounds, your fears, your desires, you can show up for others without projecting all of that onto them. There's also a freedom that comes from this kind of awareness. When you stop trying to control or improve everyone around you, you realize how much energy you've been wasting. You realize that life is not a project to be managed, but an experience to be lived. You stop playing the role of the hero, and you start being a participant. And ironically, this is when you actually become more helpful because your actions are no longer tainted by ego or anxiety. We live in a world obsessed with improvement, self-improvement, social improvement, technological improvement. We are constantly told to fix ourselves and fix the world. But what suggests a radical alternative? What if we began by simply understanding ourselves? What if, instead of rushing to improve everything, we took the time to observe, to listen, to be present? Well, we maybe see that some things don't need fixing at all, that what we call broken is often just different or unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Humility is the key that unlocks this perspective. It's not glamorous, and it doesn't win applause. But humility allows us to see the limits of our knowledge and the depth of life's complexity. Trust that people have their own paths. When we approach others from this place of humility, presence, and self-awareness, our help becomes lighter. It doesn't carry the weight of ego or expectation. It's no longer about rescuing or controlling. It's about being with. It's about seeing the other person as they are, not as a project to be improved. And in that space, something beautiful happens. Real connection, real empathy, real healing. Alan Watts' challenge to all of us is to stop obsessing over making the world better, as if it's a broken machine. The world is not a machine, it's a living, breathing system of relationships, rhythms, and mysteries. You don't fix a sunset, or a river, or a forest. You witness it. You interact with it gently, respectfully, and with awareness. The same is true of people. The goal is not to fix them, but to understand them. And to do that, you must first understand yourself. This is why Watts' simple but profound statement resonates. Don't just do something. Stand there. Be fully present. It's a reminder that our constant urge to act, to solve, to control, is often what creates the problems we're trying to fix. Sometimes, the most radical thing we can do is stop, not out of laziness, but out of attention, to really see the person in front of us, to really feel our own motivations, to take a breath and let life be what it is, instead of what we think it should be. If you made it this far, then I want to thank you not just for watching, but for listening, for sitting with questions that don't have easy answers, for opening yourself to a deeper conversation about what it really means to help, to love, to care, and most of all, to understand. Alan Watts once said, "Don't just do something. Stand there. Be fully present." It's such a reversal of how we're taught to move through the world. But maybe that's why it's so powerful. Because presence, real presence, is not a passive thing. It's not doing nothing. It's doing the one thing we most often skip over. Showing up with our whole awareness, without needing to control, without needing to be right, without needing to be seen. In that kind of presence, healing becomes possible. Not because we force it. What they needed was someone who had done the inner work to hold space without collapsing into it or running away. That's why this whole conversation comes back to one essential practice. Self-awareness. Not the kind that becomes self-obsession or over-analysis, but the kind that builds honesty, maturity, and emotional integrity. The kind that lets you ask, where is this urge to help coming from? The kind that allows you to say, maybe I don't have the answer, and that's okay. When we approach life this way, everything softens. Our relationships change. Our activism changes. Our service changes. Because we're no longer driven by anxiety. We're driven by attunement. We're not trying to fix people. We're learning how to be with them. We're not trying to save the world. We're learning how to walk alongside it. And maybe that's what's meant all along, that the world doesn't need more rescuers. It needs more witnesses, more people who are awake in themselves, so they can meet others with honesty instead of projection, with empathy instead of ego, with humility instead of certainty. So wherever you are on your journey, whether you're a healer, a teacher, a parent, a friend, or someone simply trying to show up more authentically, I hope this video gave you something to reflect on. Not a set of steps, not a manual for being better, but a mirror, a chance to look inward gently and courageously. And if you feel like someone in your life could benefit from this reflection, I encourage you to share this video with them. Maybe it will be the beginning of a new conversation. Maybe it will be the permission they've been waiting for to pause, to breathe, to reflect. And once again, if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because we have many more videos like this coming about philosophy, presence, purpose, and the deeper side of being human. Your likes, shares, and comments help this channel grow and reach others who need these messages. And if you'd like to support us even further, we now have the Super Thanks feature enabled. You can use it to donate directly to the channel, and it truly helps us keep producing thoughtful, ad-free content. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being present. And remember, you don't have to save the world today. Just start by listening. Start by understanding. Start by being here. That's enough. That's everything.